Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to AJ 101 Criminal Law Online. And tonight's lecture is going to be on Chapter 17, covering controlled substances and alcohol abuse crimes. Now, just a couple of things to talk about before we get going. Because this is a criminal law class, we're not going to spend very much time talking about what a lot of these controlled substances or even alcohol does as far as under the influence. And we won't even be talking about a lot of ways to maybe manufacture or make the different substances. What we're going to be talking more about are some of the sections that deal with under the influence of controlled substance and alcohol, the penalties for different levels of possession of certain types of drugs, and how these different substances are categorized as well, because they are kind of categorized in a certain way that you'll see what I mean in just a few minutes. So with that being said, we're going to talk about a couple of new things as well, because in 2016, there was a ballot measure that was approved in California, which really changed made some substantial changes actually to some of the narcotics laws as it relates to marijuana. So we'll kind of get into that as well. So we're going to start off with talking a little bit about where you can find some of these different laws and what we call the Uniform Controlled Substances Act. So most drug crimes are found in Division 10 of the Health and Safety Code, beginning with section 11000, which is entitled the Uniform Controlled Substances Act. Now, this act covers such offenses as possession, sale, transportation, manufacturing, furnishing, administering, possession of paraphernalia under the influence, cultivation of controlled substances. Now, a few drug and alcohol related laws are also found in different codes. They're found in maybe the Penal Code, the Vehicle Code, and the Business and Profession Code, B&P Code for short. So there are some other codes out there where we can find some of this. However, the Uniform Controlled Substances Act covers the legal as well as the unlawful use of controlled substances. So, for example, treatment of addicts and the requirements for prescriptions and offenses and penalties, all of those are described in that act. Now, as you can see at the bottom of the slide here, in 2016, voters approved a ballot measure, Proposition 64, which did make substantial changes to narcotics laws relating to marijuana and concentrated cannabis. Now, both this proposition and the earlier ballot measure, which legalized medical marijuana, removed or reduced penalties for some of the acts involving marijuana, not all, but some, and marijuana products under California law. However, just food for thought, and you have to kind of keep this in your mind, marijuana does remain a prohibited substance under a federal law, and the possession and use of marijuana in this state remains subject to federal prosecution under the Supremacy Clause of the United States Constitution. So just a little bit of background. Now, before we get into a couple of definitions that we're going to look at that are geared more towards drugs themselves, if you will, or controlled substances themselves, I wanted to kind of define what a drug is. And again, because we're dealing with criminal law, we know that there's going to be a code section for it, and I'm going to tell you what it is. So Health and Safety Code 11014, drug means A, substances recognized as drugs in the official United States pharmacopoeia, official homeopathic Pharmacopoeia of the United States or official national formulary or any supplement therein. B, substances intended for the use in the diagnosis, cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease in man or animals. C, substances other than food intended to affect the structure or any function of the body of man or animals. And D, substances intended for use as a component of any article specified in subdivision A, B, or C of this section. Now, wow, that's a lot of legalese, but that gives you the definition of what a drug is according to the Health and Safety Code. Now, let's look at 3 definitions that I think are going to be really important as we talk about under the influence. The first one is going to be tolerance. Now, tolerance is a state in which the body's tissue cells adjust to the presence of a drug. The term tolerance refers to a state in which the body becomes used to the presence of a drug in given amounts and eventually fails to respond to ordinarily effective doses. Hence, increasing larger doses are necessary to produce desired effects. So when you hear these definitions and we go through these, start thinking of times when you've seen people or watch TV or movies or different documentaries or whatever on those that might be hooked on drugs, and see how you can apply some of these definitions to maybe some of the things that you've seen. But it does make sense when you talk about tolerance, especially that last line, talking about increasingly larger doses are necessary to produce that normal desired effect. Does that, hopefully that kind of makes sense to everybody. So the next term we're going to look at is something that deals with psychological dependence, or what they call habituation. And this is the result of repeated consumption of a drug which produces a psychological but no physical dependence. The psychological dependence produces a desire, not a compulsion, as they put it, to continue taking drugs for the sense of improved well-being. And then the last phrase that we're going to look at here is called psychological dependence, physiological dependence, I'll get it right, which is addiction. And this occurs when a person cannot function normally without the repeated use of a drug. If the drug is withdrawn, the person has severe physical and psychic disturbances. So that would be somebody that might be hooked on heroin or something, and as they can't find or keep up with the level of heroin that they need, the body will go into what they call withdrawals, and there will be severe physical and psychic disturbances or experiences that those people will definitely experience. Underneath these definitions are some other things that we're not going to go through each one, but these are where you could actually find the definition if you so desired. So if you wanted to know what the definition of marijuana is, you would go to Health and Safety Code 11018. Or if you wanted to know what concentrated cannabis was right here, you could go to the Health and Safety Code and look at 11006.5. Now, don't panic if you don't have, a vehicle code, a health and safety code, or a penal code, or any of that stuff. You can go to your search engine, whether it's Yahoo, Google, or whatever you like, and you can type in California Penal Code for marijuana, and it will pop up. And so you can find anything that you want on the internet, and it's a good source of information. So moving on, we're going to talk about opiates and psychedelics and stimulants and depressants, and how do they categorize all of these different things? Well, you can probably guess by looking at the screen that they are categorized in schedules. So controlled substance schedules, schedules 1 through 5 of the Health and Safety Code, sections 11054 through 11058, list controlled substances formerly identified as narcotics or restricted dangerous drugs. Now, the most dangerous substances with the highest potential for abuse are listed in Schedule 1 and 2, and the slightly less dangerous substances, milder or less addictive, are listed in Schedules 3 through 5. And some drugs are listed in more than one schedule, depending upon the amount of opiates that they contain. But remember now, these are substances formerly identified as narcotics or restricted dangerous drugs. So we have Schedule 1 through 5, and each schedule, as you can see, is listed in the Health and Safety Code by the code number. So anything in Schedule 1 would be under 11054, and then Schedule 2, 11055, etc. So that makes it pretty easy for us to find. So let's take a look at Schedule 1. And again, we're not going to look at all of the issues surrounding each one of these types of controlled substances, or how long you'll be under the influence, or what precursors or chemicals are needed to make it, or things like that. We're really going to stick more to the codes in this particular section. So Schedule 1 that falls under the Health and Safety Code 11054, the more commonly known controlled substances are cocaine base, hallucinogens, heroin, LSD, marijuana, mescaline, methaqualone, opiates, peyote, and GHB. And I think a lot of people already know what GHB is. So those are some that you will find in Schedule 1. Now, Schedule 2, which would be we talked about Schedule 1 and 2 would be those that are the most addictive, etc. Schedule 2 can be found under Health and Safety Code 11055, and you have amphetamine, cocaine, codeine, Demerol, methadone, morphine, opium, phenobarbital, Percodon, and secobarbital. And you're not going to have to know all of these, so don't panic about trying to memorize all the different ones here. Schedule 3, Health and Safety Code 11056, you can find things like anabolic steroids, barbiturates, depressants, PCP or phencyclidine, stimulants, testosterone, and again, GHB, but the FDA approved GHB. And then 4 and 5, Schedule 4 is under Health and Safety Code 11057 and includes depressants such as barbiturates and tranquilizers. Those are listed in the schedule, and Schedule 5 is under 11058 of the Health and Safety Code, and this would be where compounds containing narcotic and non-narcotic medicinal ingredients are listed primarily in that particular schedule. So again, you don't have to know all of that stuff. It's just a good source of information. So what about possession? So now we kind of know, we've seen a lot of different controlled substances and their names and what schedule they kind of fall under. And we've learned about things like tolerance and habituation and both psychological and physiological dependence. So we've got those under our belt now. So what about possessing controlled substance? Well, one may not legally possess any controlled substance unless it was obtained by a written prescription from a physician, dentist, podiatrist, or veterinarian licensed to practice in California. Now, illegal possession is a felony, misdemeanor, or infraction. The substance possessed must be in a usable amount to constitute a crime, except for those with certain prior convictions and those who use firearms to commit other crimes. Defendants convicted of simple possession must be sentenced to probation and treatment and cannot generally be incarcerated. But really all you need to know for this one here, for possession, the substance really that's possessed needs to be what we call now a usable amount, or a usable dose. And when you look at narcotics possession, you can find that under Health and Safety Code section 11350 or 11350, and we'll get into marijuana possession in a minute, but I want to finish this. And this section 11350 of the Health and Safety Code makes unlawful possession of any of the following substances that I'm going to list here in a minute for personal use a misdemeanor. Now, kind of take note on this: heroin, cocaine, and peyote cannot be legally prescribed no matter what. But cocaine, codeine, Demerol, dilaudid heroin, mescaline, methadone, methaqualone, morphine, opium, peyote, or THC. So that section 11350 under narcotics possession makes it unlawful to possess any of the following or those that I just listed for personal use. Okay, so I think we're kind of caught up now. So now let's move into marijuana. I'm sure this is the part that everybody's just buzzing over. Hey, I made it funny. Buzzing, get it? Come on, you're with me, right? Okay, anyway, on a more serious note, yes, Prop 64 or Proposition 64 did change the face of some of the aspects of marijuana. So let's kind of walk through some of these and get everybody up to speed. So marijuana possession. Well, Health and Safety Code 11357A says possession is illegal for those under the age of 21 years old. Health and Safety Code 11357B says possession of more than 28.5 grams of marijuana punishable by imprisonment in the county jail, infraction for those under 18, and other prohibitions that are out there include possession on school grounds, concentrated cannabis, and also we're going to have to look at medical marijuana. So in looking at the marijuana section, remember, possession is illegal for those under the age of 21, and possession of more than 28.5 grams of marijuana is punishable by imprisonment in the county jail or infraction for those under 18. And there are some other areas that you actually can't possess it. Now, what about some of the new stuff? Okay, meaning that the lawful adult recreational use possession section. And these are a couple of the new things here. So Health and Safety Code 11362.2 tells us that persons 21 years of age or older may possess, transport, purchase, obtain, or give away. Okay, you don't see sell in there. Give away to someone 21 years of age or older, not more than 28.5 grams of marijuana or 8 grams of concentrated cannabis, and may smoke marijuana inside private premises and outdoors on residential grounds unless prohibited by local ordinance. And this cannot be the basis for a detention, search, or arrest. So there's going to need to be some other articulable facts in there. that officers need to draw upon to investigate certain things relating to marijuana. However, I just want everybody to understand that, remember, the cities in which you reside and even the counties in which you reside both can make and have the authority to make restrictions or local ordinances, as they call them, in those counties and those cities. And one of them could be that you can't smoke this there, or you can't smoke this here. So just keep in mind that you have to know your cities and counties' local ordinance as well in order to do that. So that's the possession part. Now, the unlawful use or possession of marijuana, along with the new laws based on Prop 64. So Health and Safety Code 11362.3 says marijuana may not be smoked or ingested in any public place, nor smoked in any place where tobacco smoking is prohibited. Okay, so we've got those two things basically in line. Smoking marijuana or ingesting marijuana products is prohibited while driving. So you can't drive down the street with a joint in your mouth, just like you can't drive down the street drinking a beer. So it's on the same level here. Open containers of marijuana or marijuana products, if you will, may not be possessed while driving or riding in the passenger seat of a vehicle. And most of these violations are infractions, and this is under 11362.4. And if you look at the alcohol laws, they're not too much different. As a matter of fact, they almost mirror themselves, because the passenger in your vehicle can't have an open container either. So I believe that in formulating these laws, they have kept them very consistent between the recreational use of marijuana and the use and consumption of alcohol. And before I go any further on there and we get to medical marijuana, I wanted to address one other thing, because there's always someone in the class that's probably thinking, well, if I can have, recreational marijuana, can I grow it? Is there something that governs that particular thing? Well, actually there is, because remember, there's a code for everything in criminal law. So Health and Safety Code section 11358 talks about marijuana planting and processing. Persons under 18 who cultivate or process any marijuana committed an infraction. Okay, so you can't do it under 18, right? Persons 18 to 21 who cultivate or process not more than 6 living plants commit infractions. Persons 18 or older who cultivate or process more than 6 living plants commit a county jail wobbler. Okay? And there's a couple of other sections that I'll get to, but when you're 21 or older, there is a section, and I don't happen to know it offhand, to where you can actually have a certain amount of plants. But actually, I think I did say it. If you go back, persons 18 to 21 who cultivate or process not more than 6, there you go, living plants commit an infraction. So if you're less than that, then you're okay as far as that particular age group. Now, if you're under 18, you can't do that. All right, so I think we've got it all those new laws kind of wrangled up. And what about medical marijuana? Well, does that go away? Well, it doesn't. Health and Safety Code 11362.5 covers this. So section 11357, possession, and 11358, cultivation, shall not apply to a patient or primary caregiver who cultivates or possesses marijuana for medical purposes. And pursuant to a written or oral recommendations of approval of a physician, okay, which means you kind of need a prescription basically, and law enforcement officers must accept a medical marijuana card unless, of course, they believe it to be fraudulent. So if we think it's fake, we can take measures to determine whether or not it's fake or not. Now, the county health department must issue photo identification cards to patients and primary caregivers upon satisfactory proof that the patient has a physician's prescription for medical marijuana. And again, law enforcement are required to accept such cards unless they believe those cards to be fraudulent. And one other point of note here, no medical marijuana dispensary or cooperative may be located within 600 feet of any public or private K through 12 school. And then don't forget, cities and counties may enact local ordinances to establish greater restrictions on these type of establishments. I already know of some cities that have ordinances against medical marijuana dispensaries, and the cities, through the court process, have been given the authority to do that. So just kind of food for thought as we're discussing a little bit more of this. So before we get into some elements of possession, I wanted to kind of go over one other section that's not covered in our presentation tonight, which would be Health and Safety Code Section 11377, and this is a controlled substance provision. And we already looked at that provision that talked about possession, narcotic possession. That was Section 11350, if you remember, that talked about the possession of personal use of any of these types of different drugs or narcotics, if you will, would have been a misdemeanor. Well, Section 11377, this section makes the unlawful possession for personal use of any of the controlled substances which are listed in Schedules 3, 4, and 5, and which is not a narcotic drug without a prescription, a misdemeanor. And this includes things like amphetamine, like speed, barbiturates, LSD, methamphetamine, methaqualone, phencyclidine or PCP. Everybody ever heard of like mushrooms? So psilocybin or Ritalin. And also in a separate section, possession of ketamine is in fact a misdemeanor as well. So now we're going to kind of keep on going when we talk about elements of possession, because we're not just going to talk about, the penalty for possessing a drug. Well, how do they determine possession? Well, in order to prove the commission of the crime of possession under the Health and Safety Code, each of the following 4 elements must be proved. And I know it seems like a lot, but it's really not, because law enforcement officers make these types of arrests quite often. So the first one is that a person exercised control over or had the right to exercise control over a certain controlled substance. So like maybe it's in the person's backpack and that's their backpack and nobody else's. Or maybe it's their car and it's registered to them. And I'm using those terms just kind of in a general sense. So that person has control over their room or something. So that a person exercised control over or had the right to exercise control over. The next one would be that such person had knowledge of the presence of the controlled substance. Now, yes, you're probably thinking, and a lot of people do that, you make an arrest, you go through somebody's pockets lawfully after an arrest because you can search incident to an arrest, and you find something in their pocket and the first words out of their mouth would be, hey, I didn't know that was there. And that does happen, but there are other ways, along with other evidence and inferences, meaning actions of the person involved, that will help you get that knowledge, that requisite knowledge that they did know that there was a presence of a controlled substance. The next one would be that such person had knowledge of its nature as a controlled substance, meaning that they knew that it was a controlled substance. And then finally, that the substance was in the amount sufficient to be used as a controlled substance. Now, remember, just like in burglary and some other crimes, we talked about two types of possession. And we talked about actual possession and constructive possession. And I think in burglary, we use actual and constructive entry. But this is going to be more of the possession thing. So we're going to talk about actual possession and constructive possession. So actual possession is where a person who knowingly has direct physical control over a thing. It's in my hand, it's in my pocket, it's in my sock, my backpack that's on my back, okay, or what have you. Now, constructive possession is a person who, although not in actual possession, knowingly has the right of control over a thing, either directly through another person or persons, and they call this basically dominion and control. So hopefully that kind of clears that up. And let me give you a little bit more on constructive possession. So again, kind of as a review, and this will help us because it expands it a little more. A person who, although not in actual possession, knowingly has the right of control over a thing, either directly or through another person or persons, is then in constructive possession of it. Now, it is not unlawful for a person to possess controlled substances that have been prescribed for another if possession is to facilitate delivery to the prescription holder. So basically, if I'm picking up your prescription for you, then that's okay. Or to discard the substance, meaning I'm taking it to a place to properly dispose of it. The law recognizes also that one person may have possession alone, or that two or more persons may jointly share actual or constructive possession. So again, kind of an interesting phenomenon, if you will, when you look at the laws of possession. So before we get into under the influence, I want to talk about two really quick items that aren't listed here. And the first is, and again, it has to do with under the influence, but it's not up on the screen. So there's a fairly new section in the Health and Safety Code, 11376.5. And it talks about the fact that it shall not be a crime for a drug overdose victim or his or her associates to be under the influence or to possess narcotics or paraphernalia, and narcotics for personal use, they mean, when medical aid is sought for an overdose. Now, this is commonly referred to in the law enforcement and public safety realm as a Good Samaritan rule, in a sense, okay? And basically the rationale for this rule was brought about by the fact that heroin is at an epidemic proportion. All the way from back, there are states back east that are experiencing unbelievable heroin deaths. There's a precursor in a drug out there called fentanyl, and they're either selling straight fentanyl or they're using this fentanyl to cut and to add into the substances that they're using for heroin that they're selling, and it's killing people at an alarming rates all over. And it's even starting to trickle out here, and heroin is becoming a lot more popular because initially you can take it in a pill actually, or in a tablet, or you can even smoke it. And then of course, after time, you're probably going to start to inject it, but it's extremely cheap as well. So with that being said, because of the rate of overdose, and also one other thing is they're actually training officers around the United States to bring with them a certain type of drug that will help people that overdose, and they're basically passing legislature that allows the officers to administer these drugs, something that we never ever thought would happen. So that's because of the fact that this heroin epidemic is running rampant. Along with that, and I keep thinking of all these different things, in some different places like in Vancouver, and they're actually trying to get this into the United States in places like Seattle and some other locations, they have government maintained locations where you can take your illegal drugs that you've purchased off the street, usually heroin, and you can bring them into these government maintained buildings or offices, if you will, medical facilities, and they will give you a clean environment with needles and things to clean yourself to inject and use those drugs. And they will also monitor you while you're there. So just in case you overdose, they have medical personnel available for you. So think of where we've come in this whole epidemic of heroin. It's becoming incredible. And I'll try to post, if I haven't, a couple of videos on a lot of those centers that are there that are popping up all over where you can actually use these drugs that you buy illegally. And I know that's kind of weird where the government is supporting the use or allowing you to go out on the street and purchase the stuff illegally, but bring it into a building maintained by the state, if you will, and let you use that illegal substance in there. But I think it's because of the amount of deaths that are occurring. They're trying to get a handle on this type of thing. So that goes back to this section here of 11376.5. And the reason for this section is, in fact, because we're experiencing so many overdoses across the United States, and people that are under the influence, or if they possess a very small amount of substance, they were afraid to call in fear that the officers would get there and arrest them when all they're trying to do is call because somebody overdosed. Does that make sense? So it's kind of, you can understand the rationale and mentality for it. You don't have to agree with it, but at least you can sort of understand why it's there. So that's a little bit on aid for overdose victims and things like that. So now we'll kind of jump into the under the influence part. So if a controlled substance is appreciably, meaning enough to where you can notice, I guess, affecting the nervous system, brain, muscles, or other parts of a person's body, or is creating in this person any perceptible or abnormal mental or physical condition, such as a person under the influence of a controlled substance. So you're found to be under the influence if, again, there's any appreciably signs or symptoms affecting the nervous system, brain, muscles, or other parts of the body, or it's creating in that person any perceptible or visible abnormal mental or physical conditions. And that section is 11550 of the Health and Safety Code, and it is in fact a misdemeanor to use or be under the influence of the many drugs that I'm going to list here in just a minute in these different schedules, except authorized by a physician. Now, some of these more commonly abused drugs are covered in this particular section. So amphetamine, cocaine, codeine, Demerol, heroin, mescaline, methadone, methamphetamine, methaqualone, opium, peyote, and PCP. So it is a misdemeanor to use or to be under the influence of these drugs listed in this particular section right here, except as authorized by a physician. Now, a couple other sections that they have underneath here would be what they call toluene, and you find that in the penal code. So here's a drug, if you will, found in the penal code. So penal code 381 talks about it being a misdemeanor to be under the influence or possess toluene, which is glue, paint, etc., or similar substances for the purpose of inhaling the fumes. And then Penal Code Section 647, you can see it there, F, and 647I, but I'm going to go over Penal Code Section 647F. This section makes it a misdemeanor to be under the influence of any drug, toluene, controlled substance, intoxicating liquor, or combination of drugs and alcohol in a public place. And under this circumstance, the person must be unable to care for his or her own safety or the safety of others. So what about transportation, sale, and manufacturing? Well, you know what? We're not going to go into all of these different sections. There's so many, but I will talk about possession for sale because I think it's one of the sections that you tend to run into quite often, specifically as an officer. If you catch somebody with what you believe might be items packaged a certain way in conjunction with maybe a lot of money, a scale, a large amount of narcotics, and what have you. So here are the elements for possession of sale. In order to prove the commission of the offense possession for sale of a controlled substance, each of the following must be proved. Now, number one, the person must unlawfully exercise control or had the right to exercise control over a certain controlled substance. Number two, that such person had knowledge of its presence. Number three, that such person had knowledge of its nature as a controlled substance. Number four, that the substance was in the amount sufficient to be used for sale or consumption as a controlled substance. And finally, number five, that such person possessed the controlled substance with the specific intent to sell. So, example, very quickly, if you stop someone and you have lawful right to search them and you find one little balloon of heroin in their pocket and $10, that probably is not enough to show possession for sale, right? Because you really don't have other elements to help you kind of make you think that, hey, this person is selling. Well, in the same scenario, if you were to lawfully search someone and in one pocket they had, let's say, $1,000 in $10 bills or $500 in $10 bills, in another pocket they had a cell phone, in another pocket they had 50 heroin balloons, that might help you make your case a little bit better because you can kind of start to get your articulable facts and start, building your case on why you would believe that this would be more for sale than actually personal use. And when you're talking about those sections, one last thing to look at, and then I'll move on. When you're looking at possession for sale, there are a lot of times where people don't use the product, they only sell it. So if they're selling heroin and the person has no needle marks, that just kind of helps you. It doesn't mean that everybody shoots up, but the majority do. And if the person's not using the product, again, that could be something else that you could use to build your case for possession for sales. But here you have a lot of different sections for sale and manufacturing. A couple of interesting sections as well as we're starting to finish up would be selling imitation drugs. So yes, you're not allowed to do that. It is a felony wobbler to sell any substance in place of a controlled substance, leading the buyer to believe that he or she is buying a controlled substance. Now, this section obviously gives the police a weapon to control incidents involving fake drug sales. The suspect cannot escape punishment by claiming that when they sell talcum powder for heroin, for example, they're not violating the law. So you have the same section underneath that for, let's say, manufacturing. And then there are sections for possessing drug paraphernalia. And while it lists three here, we're going to talk about one specifically, which is 11364 of the Health and Safety Code. So it is unlawful to possess any device or paraphernalia used for unlawfully injecting or smoking most controlled substances. Now listen though, until January 1st of 2021, as a public health measure to prevent the spread of communicable diseases, this prohibition does not apply to possession of hypodermic needles and syringes for personal use if lawfully provided by a physician or an exchange program. And there are some cities that have exchange programs where you can get clean needles. Again, and it's really there to prevent the spread of communicable diseases. Now, how about visiting places where drugs are sold, or maintaining a place to sell drugs, like they used to call like a crack house, which is kind of old school, I guess. So yes, there are some sections that talk about visiting places where drugs are sold. Now, because visiting places where drugs are used, because of the change in marijuana, the first section, 11.365, is going to change a bit. So it is a misdemeanor to knowingly visit or be present in any room or place. Now think about this, where specified controlled substances are being unlawfully smoked or used. It includes such drugs as heroin, peyote, opium, and cocaine, but it does not cover marijuana, and that's because of the passage of Prop 64. Now, it is still it's a felony wobbler, however, as we're going to kind of go down the list here, maintaining a place for using drugs, to open or maintain a place for unlawfully selling, giving away, or using any of the controlled substances specified. And those controlled substances under this section would be cocaine, heroin, opium, marijuana, peyote, THC, and mescaline. And this section basically prohibits those crash pads or shooting galleries or crack houses or whatever. And then finally, there's a section for false compartments for smuggling drugs. And yes, that is there. It is a felony to design or install a false compartment in a vehicle with intent to facilitate drug smuggling. And it is a wobbler to use, possess, or control such a false compartment with similar intent. And also keep in mind, as we're getting closer, that any person convicted of specified narcotics offenses, or any person who was discharged or paroled from a penal institution where he or she was confined because of the commission of any of those offenses that are listed in this section 11.590, or any person convicted in any other state of any offense which, if committed or attempted in this state, would have been punishable as one of the above mentioned offenses, shall within 30 days of his or her coming out into any county or city which the person lives, would have to register with the chief of police of the city in which he or she resides, or the sheriff of the county. So just like arson, you would have to register as an arson registrant. You could be a gang registrant. You could be a sex registrant. And of course, you can also be a narcotics registrant. All right, so now we're going to finish up with driving under the influence, and then we'll be done. So we're going to look at just a couple of sections here, specifically the vehicle code. So again, here's a different code. We're not in the BMP code, or we're not in the health and safety code. So now we're going to kind of go over to the vehicle code. And the section Vehicle Code 23-152, the vehicle code defines any one of the following three acts as a misdemeanor offense. Okay, driving a vehicle under the influence of an alcoholic beverage or any drug. Okay, so it's not just alcohol, or under the combined influence of both. It is also unlawful for any person who has a 0.08% or more by weight of alcohol in his or her blood to drive a vehicle. And 3, it is unlawful for any person who is addicted to the use of any drug to drive a vehicle. Now note, this offense doesn't apply to a person who is participating in a methadone treatment program as provided by law. Now, what the code here is trying to tell you is that, if you don't know, there really are in essence two pieces to that section DUI, to driving under the influence. The first is the A section, 23-152A, which means you are driving a vehicle and you are impaired by either drugs, alcohol, or both. The second half of that section is 23-152B, and that's where they take a blood test or a pee test or a breath test, and they find out that your alcohol level is 0.08 or above, that is the legal limit in the state of California. So you can still get arrested for A and not be charged with B, or you can get arrested for both. I just wanted to make sure that you understood that. Now, there are some other sections here that we're not going to spend a lot of time going over. You can look at those at your leisure. The last point that I wanted to make before we kind of end for the evening is that a person convicted of DUI with 3 or more prior convictions for DUI, or what they call a wet reckless, which means it was a DUI and they dropped it down, the penalty can actually be a felony instead of a misdemeanor. Now, it's different if you're DUI and you run somebody over and cause injury or things like that, but we're just talking about straight DUI arrest. So subsequent offenses. A person convicted of DUI with 3 or more prior convictions for DUI, it will make it a felony. So to wrap up our lecture for this evening, we've put together this really cool chart that on the left shows you the drugs, on the right it shows you the schedule that they're in, and then towards the middle it kind of tells you the name of what it is that we're talking about. And then towards the right, you can see Health and Safety Code section. It gives you the section that it's under, and then the use by a minor. So we can look at like heroin. And remember, some of these obviously are non-prescription. Okay, so let's look at heroin. We know it's a Schedule I drug here in California. Its prescribed name, well, it's not a prescription drug, so there is none. Simple possession is a violation of 11350 of the Health and Safety Code. Possession for sale would be 11351 of the Health and Safety Code. Actual sale, meaning that you did a hand-to-hand sale or transportation, that would be a violation of 11352 of the Health and Safety Code. And use of by a minor would be 11353 of the Health and Safety Code. So we can go through these and you can look at all the different ones that are there, and it'll kind of help you, again, discern the different drugs and where they fit and what have you. So we'll do one more real quick, and then we can kind of move on. So LSD, we'll look at that. It's under Schedule I in California. It's not prescribed, so it's not going to have anything right there. Simple possession of LSD is a violation of 11377 of the Health and Safety Code. Possession for sale is 11378. Sale or transportation is 11379. And use of, minor is 11380. So hopefully this kind of helps you discern again where all these different levels of things kind of fall. And with that being said, that's going to be the end of our lecture for this evening. And of course, if you have any questions, please post them on the general discussion board, or you can send me an email if you don't want to post them on the discussion board. And again, please note at the end of the chapter, there are the student resources there to assist you. So with that being said, that'll be the end of Chapter 17 lecture. And until next time.